This is Business Weekend with Ross Greenwood.
Hi and welcome to Business Weekend. I'm Ross Greenwood. It's great to have your company. Coming up on the program today, the review of the Reserve Bank is underway and it will bring significant change to our central bank. Today, we speak with one of Australia's most noted economists, Professor John Quiggin, who was a part of a group that called for this review.
We need to think about whether the very low rates of inflation we've targeted the right ones, given that we saw a long period here and overseas with interest rates at zero.
An ANZ bank launched plans to buy Suncorp's bank for $4.9 billion, but there's criticism that it's just buying back market share in mortgages that it lost in the past 5 years. CEO Shane Elliott responds to those criticisms.
If people are worried about housing in Australia, ANZ is the least of your problems.
And one of Australia's biggest beef producers responds to the threat of foot and mouth disease from Bali and Indonesia. If it escapes and breaks out here, it could cost us $300 million a week.
It's a massive risk. It'll have a huge impact on the industry. It'll wipe it out overnight.
Also on the program today, the head of one of Europe's biggest energy companies worried by the threat of Russian gas supplies. That's why he's here doing deals with Andrew Forrest's Fortescue. So all of that and more coming up on today's program. But look, let's start the program today with the review of the Reserve Bank. Before the last election, both sides of politics promised a review into the role and settings of our central bank. Shadow Treasurer Angus Taylor welcomed the review, as did the RBA Governor Philip Lowe, who'd previously pushed for any review to be conducted by the Reserve Bank itself and Treasury. Jim Chalmers, though, went in a different direction. Review or no review, one thing is clear. The Reserve Bank is going to keep putting interest rates up.
You know, we need higher interest rates. That level of interest rate is too low, and we're going through a process now of steadily increasing interest rates, and there's more of that to come.
That is a far cry from the Philip Lowe of 8 months ago.
Given the information we currently have to hand, it's still entirely possible that the cash rate will remain at its current level until 2024.
I don't want this to be all about taking pot shots at the Governor or the Board. I don't want it to be primarily about second-guessing decisions that the Board has taken, particularly in the recent past.
The review will be broad-sweeping. It'll be about the RBA culture, who it hires, who sits on the Board, whether it measures the right things.
They're not saying that publicly, they're welcoming it. But that's not the RBA culture. The RBA tends to resist external engagement.
What will be examined is its inflation target, now between 2% and 3%. It's been missed pretty much every year for the past 8 years.
The question I think has to be addressed is the 2 to 3% inflation target set up in the early 1990s the right thing to still have? And the reason I ask that is that it is higher than the rest of the world.
And the RBA Governor wants more wriggle room.
In most other countries that have under-reviewed their inflation targeting arrangement, they've come to the conclusion that a flexible inflation target centred somewhere around the 2% mark is the best we can do.
Whatever the target, the RBA is on notice from the Prime Minister. You got rate settings wrong once, don't get them wrong this time around.
The Reserve Bank will make its decisions based upon their assessment of where the economy's at, but they need to be careful that they don't overreach as well. Of course, the Reserve Bank declared a while ago, and they've conceded the error, that interest rates would stay at the extraordinarily low levels where they were for a period of years up to 2024, and that hasn't been the case.
The future well-being of the Australian economy may well depend upon it. So let's bring in here John Quiggin, Professor of Economics at the University of Queensland and one of the country's most prominent economists. He was among a group of leading economists that called for a review of the Reserve Bank. In an open letter, those economists said the review needed to be led by someone from overseas for perspective, also needed to consider the RBA Act and its commitment to full employment, as well as the bank's structure and culture, how it communicates with the public, plus also the composition of its board appointments. John Quiggin, thanks for your time. Just to start off, did the Treasurer cover all of the points that you hoped for?
He did. I think the terms of reference are good, and excluding things like APRA, the Prudential Regulation Authority, is also a good move to focus on the key issues of how does the bank operate and is its current policy framework the right one.
Okay, so what motivated you to join that group of economists to call for this review in the first place?
Well, I guess I've certainly been concerned that the inflation targeting regime is really no longer fit for purpose. So I would certainly like to see that issue addressed, and in that context, we're much more likely to get an open discussion if the panel, the review panel, has a great credibility of its own, some strong economists, rather than, for example, if it had leading business people, for example, who might do a good job in many respects, but wouldn't be equipped to challenge the views of the bank.
So the Reserve Bank governor this week effectively said he wants a more flexible approach to inflation. Does he actually need more wriggle room, or is it really a situation where, the Reserve Bank should be bound to certain measures of inflation?
Well, in my view, we need some fairly radical changes. We need to accept higher rates of inflation than the 2 to 3% target, which was appropriate as a way of breaking inflationary expectations back in the early 1990s, but now it doesn't leave enough room for monetary policy when we have a shock like the COVID pandemic. We and everyone else went to zero. We would have liked to have rates lower than that, but of course you can't have a rate lower than zero. If we had a bit more inflation, we could have a real interest rate substantially lower than we had and more effective monetary policy. Then there's a broader question of whether targeting an inflation number is the right way to go, or whether we should be looking at a measure which incorporates explicitly both parts of the Reserve Bank's commitment to full employment of the economy and to price stability, something like the rate of nominal GDP growth, which would include a commitment, therefore, to have GDP growing at a rate consistent with full employment.
I'll come back to full employment shortly because I want to talk about that, but I just want to go to one issue. The Treasurer this week said this would be no witch hunt of the Reserve Bank, but I just wonder whether the Reserve Bank should be beyond reproach. After all, did the Reserve Bank make mistakes over the course of the past 18 months or so?
Well, I think, like nearly everybody, the Reserve Bank was surprised by the extent of inflation we had. I don't think it's reasonable to single them out. Nearly everybody got that wrong. Of course, no one predicted the Ukraine war, which has piled up more pressure. But also, I think we're probably on the side of excessive expansion during the pandemic. Most countries were. That was the better mistake to make of the two compared to, for example, what happened after the global financial crisis. It has left us with a fair bit of inflation to work through. Looking at the period before the pandemic, I think there's a pretty strong case that interest rates were too high and unemployment was too low. There, I think the issue really is the model, the model of inflation targeting and the concept of the NAIRU, the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, that's behind that. So that general model, which has been adopted by the bank, Reserve Bank and other central banks, is the problem rather than specific errors by specific people within the bank.
Okay, so was the Prime Minister wrong this week to identify that he thought the Reserve Bank had made mistakes and he was hoping it didn't overshoot effectively in raising interest rates or holding them too high for too long, therefore potentially damaging the economy in this upraising cycle?
Well, I think it's fair to say most central banks tried to keep interest rates too high in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, and most of them failed. That's a mistake we certainly want to avoid. There's a separate question, of course, of whether we're going to continue with the very strong separation we've had between the government and the central bank for the last 30 years, or go back to a situation which prevailed before that, where the official family, the Treasury and Reserve Bank and the government worked much more closely together to try and stabilise the economy. So we'll really have to see how that works out, and that's one issue I think the inquiry will have to address.
Okay, then come back to this wages issue, because quite clearly there is a situation where the notion of full employment appeared to change. At one point it seemed to be something with a 4 in front of it, maybe the low 4s. Then all of a sudden it was something with a 3 in front of it. Is it really dangerous to try and get what you wish for with full employment? Because with an unemployment rate of 3.5%, of course, it puts pressure on inflation, on wages inflation, and of course skills shortages across Australia.
Well, we haven't, of course, seen any significant pressure on wage inflation. It's certainly true that if you have full employment, another way of calling it full employment is skill shortages, that when you have high unemployment, you can put an ad in the paper and hire whoever you want if you're an employer. When everybody's employed, it's more difficult to hire staff. So in some sense, that's what full employment is. We have seen, I think, well, not only 4, but the estimated rate was above 5 for quite a while. And that, I think, does reflect part of the danger of having a targeting policy that reflects only inflation and not what's happening in the real economy.
Good to have you on the program today. Many thanks for your time.
Thank you, Ross.
First, this week, UK inflation hit 9.4%, its highest rate in 40 years. In America, it's 9.1%. And this week coming, Australia's inflation rate, now 5.1%, is expected to jump above 6%. But the Reserve Bank is already talking about 7% plus. Now, this inflation eventually has to erode parts of the economy, especially employment prospects. So let's bring in here Adam Crichton, Washington correspondent for the Australian newspaper and a contributor for Sky News. Adam, a lesson from you, if you will. In Australia, commonly I hear from the Reserve Bank Governor or the Treasurer that things are okay because record numbers have a job. But is there a lesson from the US that eventually this story changes if inflation stays too high?
Well, look, I think the lesson there is that if you go back through business cycles over the last 50 years, whether it's Australia or the US, you find that the unemployment rate increases extremely rapidly just all of a sudden. So it's quite often a signal, if you like, when you have a very low unemployment rate, that there's a high probability of a sudden rise in it. Now the immediate threat now, of course, is a sudden increase in interest rates, which we're seeing around the world, in the US, also Australia. Fears, as you know, that central banks might go too far. I know the Australian Prime Minister just said that recently in a veiled warning to the Reserve Bank not to increase too much. But as you suggested in your intro, there's always, there's a medium to longer term impact too of this structural increase of inflation on the economy. Now, it's interesting at the moment, you've got falling real wages at the moment. You've got a wage growth in Australia and the US that is lower than inflation, but it's possible that could turn around if you get a breakout in wages growth, which can happen at these low rates of unemployment.
Okay, so then we get to a situation where you've got right now a case whereby you've got full employment, and everybody says that's a fantastic thing to have, and it is, that's absolutely right. But if you don't have a pool of future employment, now in Australia that could come from borders being opened and immigration coming through the door, if you don't have that pool, then ultimately you've got to push up your prices. If you push up your prices, your businesses become less competitive. If that happens, eventually those companies make decisions about whether they need to employ labour or not.
Yeah, look, that's right. That's why economists traditionally have had something called the NERU, the non-accelerating rate of unemployment, and it used to be a lot higher than your 3.5% unemployment that you have now. It used to be 4.5% or 5% unemployment, and below that level, that's when economists would think at least that wages would start to rise, and those economic cycles that you were referring to would start. Now we're currently at 3.5 in Australia, 3.8 in the US roughly. So these certainly are levels historically where you will get rapid increases in wages, and we are seeing increases in the US of more than 5% in wages, nominal wages. That's the highest it's been probably for decades, I would say, and I assume Australian wage rises are getting up to 5% as well.
So I just get to this point because there's one other aspect of this, and that is that employers might in the future say, well, let's not employ more people, let's go to automation. And so it can actually drive productivity inside businesses, the fact that you've got very high wages. But of course, that's not so good for your housing market. That's not so good for retail sales. That's no good for your whole economy, even government in Australia, which collects more than half of its revenue from PAYG taxpayers.
Well, look, this is the great raging debate amongst the greatest minds about whether the labour force is shrinking over time because of technology. I mean, certainly you see in Europe where they have structurally very high unemployment rates, that's partly to do with the cost of labour. And you're quite right. In those countries, you see far more automation. I think France is a very good example. Labour costs there are so high. French companies tend to use as few people as possible. Now, that is good for firm level productivity, if you like, but of course it has social impacts when you have essentially permanent double-digit unemployment rate. So look, I think it's too early to say whether we're kind of entering that world or not. I wouldn't want to say that yet, but because people have been saying it's the end of jobs for many decades, and they keep bouncing back. So it's really too early to call on that one, I would say.
Many thanks. Talk to you very shortly. Coming up after the break, the boss of the ANZ Bank responds to criticism that it's spending $4.9 billion on Suncorp's bank to simply replace mortgage market share that it's lost in the past 5 years. Plus, one of Europe's biggest energy companies on a future with less Russian gas. This week, ANZ Bank launched a $4.9 billion acquisition plan for the banking division of Suncorp. It paid for the acquisition with a $3.5 billion capital raising. But the bank's also been criticised for the deal, with claims that it's merely buying back a mortgage book from Suncorp that replaces market share it's lost to other competitors over the past 5 years. And also those shares issued to the shareholders at a 12.9% discount to the previous price. Shane Elliott is the Chief Executive of the ANZ Bank, and he joins me now. Shane, many thanks for your time. Those criticisms have been coming thick and fast this week. How do you respond broadly to that point that you are simply replacing market share that you have lost over the past 4 to 5 years?
Well, I think that's a really simplistic way to think about things, Ross. We're buying the future, not the past. What we're buying is 1.2 million customers. So we're going to increase the customer base through this transaction for ANZ by 20%. 1.2 million customers, 700,000 of whom live in Queensland, the youngest, fastest growing state in the nation, and 400,000 of whom are main financial institution clients, i.e. these are the people who really think of that bank as their bank. So this is all about the future, not about the past.
OK, but the past is that your home lending business was clearly broken compared with some of your peers. The whole issue is it might be that you've added on another 20% of home lending customers, and indeed a whole bunch of business customers as well. But if your bank is not fixed, then you run the risk of losing those customers as well.
Again, you're talking about the past, Ross. Here to talk about today. Where we are today, ANZ is back in the game on home loans. Yes, we had our issues. We're back. We're now turning around home loan applications pretty much with the rest of the pack. 2 days to that first decision, just in line with most players. We're not the best, we'll accept that, but we're right in there, and we've got some really competitive offers out at the moment. So we grew our home loan business in the third quarter, finishing June, by $2 billion, and most of that in June alone. So I think momentum's back. We've fixed our issues, and let's not forget the acquisition we're talking about. It's still got a long way to go, but it's all about the future. As I said, 1.2 million customers, a significant step up in growth for ANZ in the right part of the country at the right time.
OK, so the proof in the pudding, to me at least anyway, that you are back in the game, that you have fixed many of those issues of the past, that you have a future with this acquisition, is that you're growing market share in your traditional book. Right now, are you growing market share in that traditional book?
You're talking about in our home loans business. It's always hard. The data's always a bit delayed, Ross, as you know. We think we're sort of back in line with our major bank peers. There'll be some that are growing faster, but we are back growing the book, as we said we would, and back in line, we think, with our major peers. We'll get the data at the end of July about how we did in June. But the other thing here is it's not all about growth. I mean, I understand we want to get back. It's also about responsible growth. This is not the time to be writing irresponsible loans. We've got to make sure we're getting the right returns on those loans and we're taking the right risk. Because as we know, these loans stick with us for a long period of time.
OK, then the other question is about the timing of this acquisition, because, of course, you're buying a home loan book at a time when there could be increasing pressure and stress on a home lending book. So is this the right time to be going out and taking on a whole lot of new mortgages, particularly inside your business?
It's absolutely the right time for us to be doing this. Suncorp Bank is a great business. It's a great franchise under the leadership of Steve Johnson at Suncorp and Clive Van Oren in the bank itself. It's never been in better shape. So this is a good business. We're buying really good customers, and ANZ has never been better prepared to take this on. Now, look, let's keep this in proportion here. if people are worried about housing in Australia, ANZ is the least of your problems. We got 13% share, and after this acquisition, we'll get to 15%. We're still one of the smaller players. So it's a step in the right direction. But, you know, we've absolutely, through our due diligence, making sure that the quality of the book that we are acquiring is a very good one. When you look at things like the loan-to-value ratio of the book at Suncorp, or you look at the amount of the debt-to-income ratios, this is a high-quality business in the right part of the country at the right time.
OK, so your own economists this week have upgraded their forecasts of where the Reserve Bank will end up the cash rate. And even the Governor this week himself has given a strong indication that it will be beyond 2.5% or more by early next year. So from that point of view, is it going to be easy to get system growth in the whole of the home lending industry in Australia at a time when interest rates are rising as rapidly as they will?
Well, one would imagine, and I don't know, that in a time of higher interest rates, actually system growth will slow. What have we seen in New Zealand more recently, which is further ahead, as you well know, in the rate rising cycle? System growth has come in close down to zero. So now I'm not making a prediction. I don't know what will happen here. There's a lot of factors, but one would imagine that system growth will slow, and that, of course, makes it easier to be in the market there. But as I said, it's not all about growth. You know, this is about value. And you've got to be looking at, you know, what is the risk we're taking on? Are we lending responsibly? And are we getting a decent return on shareholders' capital?
Are you happy to have a lot of Queensland loans inside your book? Do you believe that that property market may be more robust than other property markets that have had bigger gains, and therefore, obviously, loan-to-valuation ratios might be not under the same pressures as other parts of the country?
Well, I think there's lots to like about Queensland as a state. As I said, the demographics are very, very supportive. It's the fastest growing state in terms of population. That's always a pretty good factor to take into account. And of course, let's not forget, ANZ is re-weighting towards Queensland. We are underweight Queensland. You know, the skew of our book, probably unsurprisingly, is to Victoria and New South Wales. And this was what we really liked about this. Not only are we growing our national share, we're growing at an area that we're underweight. And an area so that gives us more diversification, and that's a really good thing as you think about risk.
OK, so was it a situation that you simply found it more difficult to compete with bigger books such as the Commonwealth Bank or Westpac have got, that this ultimately becomes a numbers game, that, say, the Commonwealth Bank had taken over Bankwest, that you'd had a situation where you had been in a situation where you hadn't participated in those previous takeovers? St George had gone to Westpac in the past, for example.
Oh, look, scale matters. You know, like a lot of industries, size does matter. You know, there are some efficiencies that come with it. I don't think it's about missing out. This is a great opportunity. I think this is a great franchise. This is a really good, well-performing bank run by a great team. And really importantly, I understand everybody wants to talk about the numbers, but there's a massive cultural fit here as well. This is a good, values-driven organisation, and the people that we've met at Suncorp are really good people, and we know that they're going to be very welcome in the broader ANZ. So we see it as a platform for growth. That's the story we've been telling the team at Suncorp. That's the story we've been telling consumers right across the country, but particularly in Queensland. This is a platform for growth. Yes, I understand. Yes, we're picking up market share. That's good. But those 1.2 million customers and growing in the right place. And we think we can bring value to that, Ross. You know, we're going to bring what we're good at. You know, what we're good at institutional banking. We're good at infrastructure. We're good at renewable finance. We're good at sustainable finance. And we're really good at connecting Australia to the opportunities across Asia. In fact, we are the best at that. And so we think the combination and the scale that we will get across Queensland and northern New South Wales and the rest of the country is really going to be that platform for growth right across our franchise, not just about home loans.
And how will you go in terms of branding? Because one thing is that people have a loyalty to Suncorp, that brand. What will you do in regards to that?
So what we've made an agreement with Suncorp Group is that once we get to completion, and we've still got a way to go, we get to operate Suncorp Bank under that brand for somewhere between 5 and 7 years. And that gives us a great opportunity, gives us time to think through the options on branding. We have a great experience in New Zealand. You will remember 2003, ANZ paid $4.9 billion then, actually, to buy the National Bank of New Zealand, which was a subsidiary of Lloyd's. And for many years, we kept the two brands separate. So we ran ANZ and National Bank. Now, ultimately, we made the decision to merge all of those under ANZ. But we've got experience in doing this. And by the way, didn't lose any customers along the way because we did it responsibly. So we've got time to think that through. And we'll be really thoughtful about what the customers of Suncorp Bank want and what the people of Queensland want and what's best for them over the long term.
OK, so dumb question. Have you worked out who's going to pay for Suncorp Stadium yet for the next 7 years?
I think that one has been looked after by the insurance side of the business. I think they've just renewed that licence, but no, that'll stay as Suncorp and be part of the insurance group.
All right, then a final one for you. This week, the Treasurer has asked for a review into the Reserve Bank and its culture, into the way in which it operates. He says it doesn't want it to be a witch hunt. Is it the right time for a review into our central bank?
Oh, I think, we haven't had a review into the central bank for many, many years. I mean, I guess you can always say it's never the right time. There's a lot going on. I'm sure they're very busy. I know we are. But, it's always a good time to rethink public policy settings. And the Reserve Bank has such an important role. And I take the Treasurer at his word. It's not a witch hunt. But we can always do better, and I think there's some great learnings that we will have seen through the operation of central banks globally, particularly through the period of COVID and this massive amount of easing that we've seen globally. So let's take the opportunity to learn and reflect and see what we can do better.
Many thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Now, while Australia's east coast continues to face gas shortages, which have resulted in wholesale electricity prices spiking back above the $400 per megawatt hour limit set by the regulator AEMO, it's nothing compared with the problems right now in Europe, where the reliance on gas from Russia has made the economy highly vulnerable. This week, Russia recommenced gas supplies to Europe via the Nord Stream 1 pipeline, which had been shut down for planned maintenance. Despite assurances from Russia that it will continue the supplies, fears remain that it could be withdrawn in retaliation for sanctions after the invasion of Ukraine. It has prompted emergency action from Germany, which says it won't allow gas to be used for electricity generation. That will be saved for households and industry use. Germany already has a policy to shut down all its nuclear power plants by the end of the year. Now it will restart the use of brown coal to generate power. This week, Germany's Economy and Climate Minister Robert Habeck accused Russia of blackmailing Europe.
Wir registrieren auch zunehmend, dass Energie nicht nur
I would like to take up and reject a comment that I read today, namely the remark from the Kremlin and Gazprom that Russia is the guarantor of energy security in Europe. This is a twisting of every fact, because actually Russia is using its great power, too great a power, that we have given to Russia to blackmail Europe and Germany.
But this gas crisis is adding inflation to Europe, which prompted the central bank to this week raise its official cash rate for the first time in 11 years by 0.5% back to zero.
We are very attentive to what happens on the energy front, and in particular on the gas front, because it has an impact on electricity price, as we all know. So, most recent evolution concerning the gas supply through Nord Stream 1 in particular is obviously a factor that we take into account.
One of Europe's biggest energy suppliers is Aon, based in Germany with operations throughout Europe and the UK. It has more than 51 million customers. Recently, Aon signed an agreement with Andrew Forrest Fortescue Future Industries to buy 5 million tonnes of hydrogen per year from 2030, with the supplies to start within 3 years' time.
This, of course, will be one of the largest energy agreements. We will create an employment-intensive industry in Australia and a reindustrialisation of Germany, a Germany which is strong, a Germany which continues to lead the world in advanced technology and in heavy industry, and this time with zero pollution.
By coincidence, Aon's Chief Operating Officer, Patrick Lammers, was in Australia this week looking at Fortescue's operations. I caught up with him to discuss Europe's energy crisis and his aspiration for the green hydrogen contract with Fortescue. Take me to the current situation in Europe with the threat that gas supplies could be cut off from Russia. What impact is that going to have on your business customers? What impact does it have on Europe's economy?
Well, I think it's of such a magnitude. It will have a huge impact on the European economics, because everything you see around you, and it's very densely populated, And we actually have a winter still, even it's very heated now in Europe. There's a huge heat wave going on. But in winter, you will have 4 to 5 to 6 months. You will have to have heating in houses, and you use a lot of gas, of course, in all sorts of industrial processes. So if there would be a gas cut, it would have a huge impact. At this point in time, we already started last year, November, seeing already a lot of volatility in the gas price, and therefore then also in coal, and then later on obviously in electricity. And that was all exacerbated obviously by the war in Ukraine. And that has a huge impact. For instance, if you look at the prices which you now see in the market, which we have to purchase for, if we pass it on fully through into our customers, you would see 6 or 7-fold the invoice for customers.
Does it have the potential to tip Europe into recession because of the price of energy, because of, if you like, the impact of simply not being able to heat, to be able to look after people in the community?
Well, there will be demand destruction obviously as well. Because of these high prices, a lot of industries obviously will say that it's absolutely useless to produce in Europe, we can do that somewhere else. And then you will have to look, what does the government do? Different governments. So you have the EU, but you have the different local governments. A large part of the bills people get for their utility is also invested with all sorts of tax and levies. So if the governments actually put that down and then the price will come through, still will be a bit balanced, but if there will be a real price hike, obviously the buying power of, let's say, a normal family will be reduced because they will have to buy this utility, gas and electricity.
Hindsight being hindsight, was it a mistake for Europe and for Germany in particular to become so reliant on that Russian gas?
Well, I mean, in hindsight, everybody is obviously much more smart than looking forward. I mean, the ones who have vision obviously are the more courageous ones. I think obviously it was a geopolitical decision as well. Energy politics normally is real politics because it's such a big chunk of our fabric which we have in every sophisticated society. I think Europe, personally, was deeply geopolitically asleep by the fall of the wall in the 90s, and then everybody being positive and everything will be fine. While of course Russia is making us very dependent on it, and if you get very cheap Russian pipe gas, all other costs can be higher or inefficient, and that's, I think, now what's the bill we are paying.
Okay, so then is there any solution to this? Is there anything around the place that can replace that gas to generate the energy that's required for Europe, for your customers?
Yeah, what is happening now is that, of course, the countries are working together, not only Germany, but the Netherlands, Belgium, Denmark, Norway, and the UK. I mean, it really happens obviously in the north around the North Sea. In the south, you have Spain and Italy, which actually extract their gas from Northern Africa, where there are pipelines there. And now, obviously, there is a debottlenecking of LNG terminals. So in Zeebrugge, Rotterdam, and there will be also floating regasification units in the north of the Netherlands and north of Germany. That will pick up some of the stuff, but obviously it needs time. But we are looking at a real, let's say, near valley for the coming at least 18 months to get all of that to be replaced. Today we are waiting for the news, but yesterday I saw that Nord Stream 1 was repressured after the maintenance period. So the Russians will probably supply again between 30 and 40% of the normal volume, which normally goes to Nord Stream 1. But obviously it will be tight.
And then take me to another aspect of this, because we're talking about gas. We do the same thing here in Australia. There are gas shortages in Australia, for example, at the moment. So one of the issues is that it was always seen to be the step between coal-fired power stations for us and, sort of the renewables, the story of the renewables and their science coming through. In Germany, for example, with the ban on nuclear power stations, it was gas that was, if you like, the link between the nuclear power and the renewables in the future. But there's a gap there, isn't it? You need that gas in the middle.
Well, I mean, there is, of course, a big acceleration. I mean, Europe has been looking very much at decarbonisation and forgetting about affordability and forgetting about superior supply. So these three things, security, supply, affordability and decarbonisation, are very important. Gas should have been the bridge, and by, let's say, Russia doing the invasion in Ukraine, which is horrible, also accelerated everything forward. So in Germany now, there is a law which says you can't use gas for making electricity because we need in other parts of the economy, and we switched on back to coal-fired plants. So the bridging then is done by coal fire, but you'll be looking at this for obviously...
Which almost defeats the purpose, because the idea was to get rid of the coal-fired power stations. So therefore, there's even conversation in Germany right now about allowing the nuclear power stations to remain open for longer. Do you think that will end up coming to pass?
Well, we see that debate in the press, and there's obviously different political parties talking about that. To come back to the coal, obviously that was never the idea, but you have it and you need it. So, I mean, it's a wall. I mean, it's not like something happened very distant. I understand when you live in Australia that you think it's far away, but Australia is also part of the Western world. And I learned a long time ago, if you have a hole in your boat, it doesn't matter if you're close to the hole or a bit further away, it's going down. So we have to really stuck that hole in the boat so the Western world can keep afloat, because I think that's, first of all, very important. Second, coal will be there for a while. Then I said the LNG will come as a bridge and probably debottlenecking some of the other gas fields in the North Sea. And then obviously you'll be looking forward and accelerating all of this into hydrogen, because that's really, of course, where we need to go.
Okay, so I want to go to hydrogen because quite clearly E.ON has done a deal with Fortescue Future Industries. It will provide green hydrogen to E.ON over a long-term contract to 2030. Just explain to me, or beyond that, just explain to me how that works, because right now there's not a lot of hydrogen being produced in the world, not at commercial quantities at least anyway. What's needed to scale it up?
Well, I mean, what you have here in Australia is you have space, and you have 50% more sunshine than we have in Europe, and you have also a lot of continuously reliable wind because of the southern hemisphere. So first of all you have that. So the one who builds that out and does that cleverly can actually produce hydrogen. It's not, let's say, technology which you have to invent, you have to scale it up. And that's a very different game than you have to invent an electrolyzer because it's there, or you do this via another chemical process. And then obviously the other thing is we are investigating together with FFI is, okay, how would the whole value chain work for both of us, and how would transport work? And we're doing an investigation on that, and where a lot of people thought it's impossible, it's actually possible. And we've done the analysis on it, and we also, both our companies believe we can make this work. Mainly also driven obviously by these very high fossil fuel prices, which are not going to go away. And if we really would price in the cost of all those fossil fuels and the CO2, which we actually give birth to into the atmosphere, by a CO2 pricing, and especially in Europe, where there's more and more talk in Brussels about we are going to make a border and say, if you pass through and you have made somewhere else CO2, we will tax you for it as well. So then green hydrogen all of a sudden becomes very economically, and in fact, which is a good thing, it gets a real price for the energy you use, because it has been too cheap and too easy to get so much CO2 into the atmosphere, which is going to destroy the Earth in the end anyway, if we go on like this. And then, putting green hydrogen against that as a very clean technology, actually, then it has a price, but it has a very competitive price.
Patrick Lemming, many thanks for your time.
Thank you very much.
Coming up after the break on Business Weekend, the threat of foot and mouth disease could cost Australia $300 million a week if it gets out. Thanks for being with us here on Business Weekend. This week there were mixed messages following an outbreak of foot and mouth disease on the popular tourist destination of Bali. Some opposition figures claim borders with Bali should be closed and strict quarantine put in place. Government and agriculture leaders worried about previous cattle export bans to Indonesia and noted that Australia already deals with many countries that have foot and mouth disease. Edward Boyd this week caught up with Lachlan Graham from Argyle Foods, one of Australia's biggest cattle producers.
The Argyle Foods Group is an integrated agri company. We operate and manage livestock on properties from Queensland down to Victoria. And within those properties, we develop and manage carbon projects as well, with overlaying regenerative ag practices on the properties. Again, we're an integrated company, so we own and operate those properties. We process the livestock. We distribute those meat products domestically and also to global markets through joint venture partnerships and troll processing partnerships. Having previously owned our own processing plants up until prior to COVID. So yeah, we've got a full sort of supply chain control, supply chain management. We supply about 5,000 retail outlets across Asia and Australia.
Yeah, where are your main customers? Is it here or overseas?
So the main customer base is probably still domestic and Asia, I guess. My brother and co-CEO is based in Hong Kong, has been there for 8 years in our office in Hong Kong. And through there we manage our exports across Asia, less so China in the last few years, but also Asia, the Middle East, the UK, and a big focus on the US market.
And how big are your land holdings across Australia?
Oh, so our acreage of land that we're operating on is around about 450,000 acres. Across different properties. Now they're sort of smaller intense properties in the southwest slopes of New South Wales up to large scale properties in western New South Wales and southern Queensland.
And roughly how much head of livestock have you got?
You know, in the last couple of years we're running anywhere between 8 to 20,000 head at any one time. And the business has really, I suppose, pivoted a lot as we hit COVID. We lost 95% of our meat sales revenue and market access. We lost our licence and access into the China market about 2 months after COVID. We also lost all our food service, our airline business. So we had a really big impact. In the last 2 years, we've obviously reset the company. A big focus on the pastoral side of the business, I guess. Building our livestock numbers, developing our carbon projects and our carbon partnerships, really sort of led by the joint venture partnership we have with the MLA. And we're gearing ourselves up to build our livestock production system so we can really penetrate the US market particularly and domestic market when the cycles change, and we're modelling that happening next year.
And will customers pay a premium for decarbonised products?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're setting a goal to sort of aim to double the value of our red meat, you know, basically our carcass utilisation, you know, by the next sort of 8 years. So it's a pretty ambitious target, but I think certainly the right consumers will pay for those claims and attributes, and those consumers are the targeted markets. Australia for one, but also the US, North American market, US and Canada, and the UK market on the back of the FTA, where consumers care about, one, the environment, the sustainability of the environment, and the quality and the welfare of the livestock that we've processed, and obviously the people that operate in our company.
Obviously a huge roadmap then for growth for your company, but what happens with foot and mouth disease on the doorstep of Australia right now in Indonesia?
Yeah, so the foot and mouth disease and the and lumpy skin disease, two very sort of concerning outbreaks, and I guess the industry as a whole, all the peak bodies and the government are doing a really good job. I think, you know, globally there's 20 other countries in the world that are FMD positive and managing that through vaccines and you know, general processes. The concern obviously with Indonesia and Bali is that it's an outbreak, so priority number one is control the outbreak. And I think, yeah, there's a lot of misinformation being put around, and I think at the moment we're doing the right thing. I think in terms of, you know, really close monitoring and of incoming customers from those two countries is critical, because I think the higher risk is the meat products being not declared or coming in people's you know, luggage and whatnot. So I think a higher and an increased sort of scrutiny of every single incoming passenger. That's where I'd be focusing on, getting more staff there, more biosecurity people, scanning every bit of luggage, unpacking every bit of luggage. I think as a next step potentially, you know, there could be, you know, like a mandatory hotel quarantine for those incoming passengers, but the key focus being that's the main risk. They're doing things like the foot baths and whatnot to monitor shoes, but the key risk is products coming in, meat products coming in that are in luggage. So I think that should be the focus. I don't think it's necessary to consider closing the borders or things like that, given the, you know, the trade implications that would have on other industries in agriculture like grains, you know, grains, horticulture, dairy, for example. So I think the key focus is really target those incoming passengers and increase awareness and advice. And I think through that, the message you get through, that'll be the best way. And I think the current biosecurity measures are actually working, like what we're picking up and how they're controlling it. So that's probably my view on where we're at, but it'll certainly have it's a massive risk. It'll have a huge impact on the industry. It'll wipe it out overnight. It'll be a massive impact on our business. We're a diversified business. We have other enterprises over and above, you know, our beef exports and our lamb exports, but, you know, our industry and agriculture in general would be decimated if this was to come in. And I think it is a key focus, and I've probably, you know, from a processor and a producer, I've never seen such a, you know, a call to arms. And we've had great biosecurity measures in place for decades now, and they've proven and they've worked. And now it's about using this as a catalyst to improve those measures and put them in place for the long term, not just the short and medium term, but the long term, and continually improve them. So I think we're getting the right message out. I think we're getting the right results. I think priority one is Australia's support to Indonesia as a trade partner to control the outbreak.
Vaccinating cattle.
Vaccinating the livestock. So I think if they can control the outbreak, then essentially Indonesia and Bali would be considered like many of the other countries that have got FMD, cases that are live and being managed and treated. So that's the priority number one. And then maintaining that as in not entering our borders. So control it at the source, help, provide assistance at the source, and then control the borders. And I think the clearest way, particularly from an FMD point of view, given it's going to be coming into the country via humans and travel, as opposed to lumpy skin disease, I think controlling it at the borders through absolute passenger checking and going through all of checking their luggage and x-raying it and controlling it, because that's the biggest risk.
Say if it does get in, what would happen? Like, would we not see any meat anymore on supermarket shelves? Or
it'd be catastrophic. Having I lived in the UK in 2000, 2001. Having seen that firsthand. So you would have the animal welfare, a lot of animals would be quarantined, immediate cessation of movement between borders. So you'd have, knock-on effect on many industries, whether that's feedlots, grain growers, grain distribution, livestock carriers. There'd be a huge suite of industries that would be knocked apart. But the animal welfare in terms of testing and destroying animals, like, it's pretty confronting, the images that we've seen in the past, and for someone that produces livestock and being certified humane is such an important aspect for our business. So that, for one, is something really uncomfortable with, what the outcome of that has to be put in place if that was the case. And then the knock-on effect is you lose immediate market access to all of the best markets in the world and the key markets. So essentially it wipes out $300 million a week of Australian trade. And then the knock-on effect would flow through to domestic retailers. There'd be a shortage of supply, there'd be lack of livestock being moved, processing falls off cliff. Yeah, essentially you'd see meat, red meat products, pork, lamb, any of those products off the shelf or in very short supply, and then that would require importing products, which Australia, one, doesn't really like to do. Secondly, as a consumer, and we're used to having such good access to good quality products in Australia that we've Australian grown. But it also inadvertently increases the risk of more biosecurity concerns by importing food products.
Lachlan Graham, co-founder of Argyle Foods Group, thanks so much for your time today.
No, great, Ed. Nice to meet you. Thanks for your time.
And that's it for the program this Sunday. Up next, all the latest news right here on Sky News. Business Weekend returns next Sunday. But don't forget, you can catch up with all the latest business news with our daily program Business Now at 4:30 and 10:30 p.m. Eastern Time, Monday to Friday. You can also see the program on our website, skynews.com.au. Thanks for your company today. I'm Ross Greenwood. We'll see you next week.